This is a copy of the sermon that will be preached at North Shields Evangelical Church on the 20th of August, and it's going to be based on the contents of 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 19 all the way to 2 Samuel chapter 15. You might want to read those chapters before listening to this sermon, but I will be going through what they're about. So I'd like you to start by asking you to make a pyramid shape. You know, one essential skill in life is to understand why pyramids look like this. For example, this pyramid shape often appears in graphs. So you might see a graph like this: a rise followed by a fall. The number of people who watch EastEnders in the last 10 years. You know, it's essential that the BBC knows what happened at the peak. What caused the sudden decline? Was the decline caused by a specific writer getting sacked? Was it when Corrie launched on ITV? Was the decline caused when they had that story about a UFO abducting a goldfish? You might see a graph of a teenager's school results, a rise followed by a fall. Every parent needs to know what happened here. Was that when they got their new Xbox? Was that when they met their girlfriend or boyfriend? Was this when you banned them from eating a tube of Smarties every day? Was that what caused the rise to turn into a fall? It's essential we all stop and step back and study graphs like this. We all need to know what caused the rise followed by the fall. If you step back and look at the reign of King David, Israel's leader, you'll see this same pyramid shape. David rises from obscurity. David defeats Goliath. David gets voted in as king. David unites the nations, brings about positive change and establishes peace. Chapters 1 to 10 of 2 Samuel describe the rise and peak of the nation. In fact, it reads in chapter 8 that David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Chapters 1 to 10 of 2 Samuel describe the rise and peak of the nation. Chapters 11 to the end describe the reign of David in decline. So the question we must ask ourselves is this: what happened here? What happened here? Well, here is exactly chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and all the Israelite army to fight. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. What follows is David in chapter 11 committing adultery and murder. In other words, when David should have been acting as a king, going out, defending the nation, upholding justice, acting as Israel's military and spiritual leader, when David should have been acting as king, he stayed behind. He stayed behind and acted out of self-interest, committed a just injustice, and acted out his corrupt and godless desires. What happened at the peak of the pyramid? The king stopped acting as king. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David stayed behind. The same pattern is repeatedly repeated in the 21st century. When kings, people in authority, people with responsibility, when these people stop using their power for good, when these people fail to take their responsibility seriously, When kings stop acting as kings, it results in much suffering for people. When prime ministers, the best of men, don't act like the best of men. When law enforcement don't actually care about the law. When spiritual leaders act in ungodly ways. When healthcare professionals no longer care. When kings, people in responsibility, people we trust, when kings stop acting as kings, it results in much suffering for the people. And yet, despite the second half of 2 Samuel repeatedly emphasizing this, this is how the book ends. Chapter 23. When one rules over people in righteousness, when he rules in the fear of God, he is like the light of morning at sunrise, on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth. You know, after being let down by so many people in positions of responsibility, it's easy to be skeptical, cynical, pessimistic, have a negative view of kings, rulers, authorities. But despite part 2 of 2 Samuel describing the failures of King David, it doesn't end by telling us to throw the idea of leadership and authority in the bin. Instead, the book ends by painting the idea of rulers in a very positive light. Instead, the end of the book asks us to change our pyramid shape to a bridge. Maybe if you're not embarrassed, you could do that now. Change your pyramid into a bridge. Now maybe picture some of the best and most famous bridges in the world. They've got beautiful stonework. They're structurally brilliant. They help you cross from one place to the other. But how about half a bridge? What would you say if you saw half a bridge? A bridge with beautiful stonework. A bridge that was structurally brilliant, but only crossed halfway. You know, that bridge has the potential to be a great help, but it falls short. What we repeatedly see in the second half of Samuel is half a bridge. King David had the potential to greatly help people, but he only did half a job. I'll begin with the first example, though there are a lot more than this. In verse 19 of chapter 13, we read that Tamar put ashes on her head. She'd just been raped by her brother. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. You know, we join Tamar after she suffered bruises, after she shed tears and tore her clothes in anguish. Her brother physically forced her to have sex with him. The emotional trauma caused her to weep aloud. She tore her clothes to express her anguish. She'd lost her virginity, her value as a person, her hope of a future. And the next words she hears are these. Her brother Absalom, that is her other brother, said to her, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." Be quiet. Don't take this thing to heart. When you've been bruised, shed tears, and had your future destroyed, what must it feel like to hear these words? I know you've been hurt by that person, but we've decided the best thing to do is stay quiet about it. I can see that suffering and injustice really bother you, but brothers are mean. Pain is normal. Just accept it. I can see that you care about what has been torn from you, but don't take it to heart. No one else cares about your life, so why should you? What pain must it cause to hear these words? What a relief it must be what relief must it have been to hear what Tamar heard next. When King David heard all this, he was furious. Who hears about this? King David, the one who has the power to do something about it, and the responsibility to do something about it as well. And what is King David's reaction? He was furious. At last, somebody who cares about Tamar's bruises as much as Tamar herself. Wouldn't you like to meet such a person? A person who cares as much about your suffering as you do. And yet what do we read next? Verse 20. 2 years later. What follows next is 2 years in which King David did nothing. David didn't act like a king or a parent and do something. Instead, he does nothing, sits back, and watches Absalom secure justice for Tamar, but in the wrong way. You know, David had the right reaction to Tamar's suffering. He felt the right feelings and possibly even said the right things. But David was like that half a bridge. David cared enough to look like he cared, but not enough to act. Maybe saying the right words to Tamar, but not doing anything practical to help. Like that half a bridge, David fell short. So why, after all this, does the book of 2 Samuel end like it does? When one rules over people in righteousness, when he rules in the fear of God, he is like the light of morning at sunrise, on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth. The book ends leaving us longing. The book ends leaving us longing for the other half of the bridge to be built. It leaves us longing for a king who will succeed where David failed. The book leaves us longing for a king who actually cares about the bruises and tears and ruined futures of every one of us. The book ends leaving us longing for a king who promises to heal wounds and put things right. The book ends with us longing for a king who follows up on these words and emotions with action. The book of Samuel leaves us longing for that type of king. And in the New Testament we hear the great announcement, the other half of the bridge has arrived. Jesus' birth is announced in the following way. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Jesus would be the king, the ruler, the shepherd who would succeed where other kings had failed. Jesus' mission is next announced. Here's my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love and whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope. Because of God's love, Jesus was sent to care for all those who've ever been bruised or shed tears or had their hopes destroyed. And Jesus accepted this mission that God gave him. Jesus in his first sermon says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." Jesus' mission was to be characterized by hope, healing, and actually putting wrong things right. But you might be saying to yourself, nice words, But isn't Jesus just another David? Half a king, half a bridge, all words, but no action. Did he not say, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor"? Don't poor people need more than words? A few quid and a sandwich, not just words and empty promises. And yet Jesus said that God had sent him to proclaim good news to the poor, proclaim freedom for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. I mean, what would you prefer? Someone who proclaimed and talked about freedom, or someone who actually freed you? What would you prefer? An appointment through the post for surgery, or the surgery itself? If Jesus just talked about these things, he's as useful as half a bridge. But if you look at all these verses closely, you might see that they've all got something in common. They're all from the Old Testament. The New Testament is just re-quoting them. In other words, the Old Testament makes us long for the other half of the bridge. A king who will put wrongs right, who will show care through action. The Old Testament makes us long for the other half of the bridge. The New Testament tells us who the other half of the bridge is: Jesus. And this longing for Jesus to put things right will continue until these words in the last book of the Bible are fulfilled. In the book of Revelation, John sees a vision of the future, a vision when King Jesus will return. And so John writes, "I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called..." What was he called? All talk and no action? Nice words that prove to be lies? No. Before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. Jesus will turn words into action. Jesus will fulfill all his promises. If you are a Christian, the hope you cling to will prove true. The next words are that with justice he judges and wages war. When Jesus returns, his passionate care for the suffering and injustice will be shown through him waging war, passionately and actually putting all wrongs right. His eyes, it continues, his eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. On his robe and on his thigh he has the name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. When Jesus returns, the King the world longs for will finally arrive. And if you've ever experienced bruises, shed tears, had good things torn from you, the arrival of such a King will be very good news. But I want you to know that when I read those words from the book of Revelation, I left out one particular description. It describes Jesus as dressed in a robe dipped in blood. Why is Jesus described in this way? Well, through the life of David, I'd like to think about why. If you read chapters 13 to 15, you'll learn that David was only half a leader. In the second half of his reign, David only half cared about justice. We saw that through his actions with Tamar. In the second half of his reign, David is only half awake. In chapters 14 and 15, David repeatedly has to be told what's happening in his kingdom. In the second half of his reign, David only makes half the decisions. In chapters 14 and 15, other people take the initiative and tell David what he should do. In these chapters, David is like that half a bridge. He acts like half a king, half a leader. And nowhere is this seen more clearly than in chapter 15. Chapter 15. the king set out with, which I'm going to read little bits of chapter 15. It says in chapter 15 verse 16, the king set out with his entire household following him. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at the edge of the city. Here we see David acting like the king Israel wanted and needed, going before the people, leading the people. This is the type of king the people wanted. They'd previously asked for a king over them who would lead them, go out before them, fight their battles. This is the type of king the people needed and that God had given them. We read in chapter 5 of Samuel that all the tribes of Israel came to David and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." Isn't that what you and I need? Someone who shares our flesh and blood. A human who can understand and empathize with human weakness. Don't we need someone who walks alongside us in suffering and pain? Don't we need someone who goes ahead of us into this battle, a battle involving pain, injustice and death? A king who leads us into the battle and leads us out of the battle, victorious at the other end. This is the king that you and I need. But what do we encounter in the world? Kings who suffer with the people, or kings who keep their distance from their ivory tower? Leaders who roll up their sleeves and fight for the right causes, or leaders who ask the people to roll up their sleeves? Even the few in authority who do care and commit to addressing injustice and suffering, rarely did they enter the battle and come out victorious. Once you've lived long enough, you soon realize that doctors and psychiatrists don't have all the answers. The words in the leader's manifesto are just words. The forms you fill out in the hope of a good practical outcome get at best a verbal response. You go into Holland and Barrett hoping for a vitamin or mineral that will solve all your problems, and you come out with the same problems plus 26 herbs which you need to take 4 times a minute. David was the same as all of these half kings. David was half a king at best. And so we read that the king set out with his entire household following. Great first half, but not so great second half. And they halted at the edge of the city. All his men marched past him, along with all the Kerethites and Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath. They marched before the king. But later on, Ittai replied to the king, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be." David said to Ittai, "Go ahead, march on." So Ittai the Gittite marched on. The whole country wept aloud as they all passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on towards the wilderness. The king is no longer leading the people into the battles they next face. They'll now have to face these battles with David behind them. What a scary thought, to think we've got to battle injustice by ourselves, or face death by ourselves, or head into the coming week by ourselves, or face the future with only our own resources to rely on. That's a scary thought. An even scarier thought that the king who half leads us cannot actually guarantee success. Later on in chapter 15 we read that the king said to Zadok, "Take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favour in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it, and his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do whatever seems good to him. David led the people into a situation in which he didn't know what the outcome would be. I hope for the best, but cannot promise it. We might come out victorious, but we might lose. I'm aiming to establish a kingdom built upon justice, righteousness, and the worship of God. But don't build your hopes up. It might not happen. And so David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. Now do you see why it's so amazing that we follow a living king, a king whose robe has been dipped in blood? On the cross, Jesus had his flesh pierced with nails and shed blood. For this reason, Jesus can understand and empathize with our suffering. On the cross, Jesus went ahead of us into battle. Jesus faced suffering, injustice, persecution, and death before any of us. If you are a follower of Jesus, you can know that Jesus not only went ahead of us into this battle, Jesus also left the battle victorious. Jesus' suffering came to an end. After injustice, he was vindicated. Jesus' death was followed by a glorious resurrection. That might be familiar to you, but don't forget just how good news this is. We follow a king whose robe has been dipped in blood. One last action to help you remember this. We follow a king. We follow a king who suffered before us. Not just for us, Jesus suffered before us. And for that reason, those who follow Jesus will cross from suffering to victory. We follow a king who suffered before us, and therefore we who follow him will pass from suffering to victory as well.